And we're live.
John, I watched you from way back in the Talk Soup days.
Yeah.
Dude, what was that experience like?
Oh man, that was awesome. I was talking about this recently.
A lot of our audience is super young. They're like 19. Can you lay it out? What was Talk Soup?
Yeah. Well, look, you guys are YouTubers. You tell me. Somebody asked me recently to describe Talk Soup, and I described it as YouTube before YouTube. Like it was the first viral video show where you were watching 1 minute clips of
highlights,
extreme weirdness of the daily talk shows, and for people that are very young, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, there was this whole genre of daytime television, Jerry Springer, Maury Povich, Richard Bay, Jenny Jones, it was a circus, right? And they were all trying to outdo one another. And that was like,
they were always delving for a new low. Would be look at it. They were like, could we get some circus freaks out there? Like, if they can find any excuse to get circus freaks actually on the stage, like a good reason to do that, they do it.
It'd be like coming up on Thursday, my girlfriend's a guy, you know what I mean? And they'd be like revealing that the woman this dude's been dating for 8 months has really got junk. You know what I mean? And so it was that. There were like all kinds of fights and midget wrestling and it was crazy, right? And so Talk Soup was a roundup of the daily talk shows, but it was also like, I was the second host. The first host was Greg Kinnear. I was a giant fan of the show when he was on it, and I was just a club comic, and I was just like Charlie with the golden ticket, and Willy Wonka. Like I just got lucky and got to take over for him. So it was like a weird sketch show. It was like this very surreal, dark, kind of comedy show that was a little out there. It was almost like a one-man SNL. It was really strange, and it was just as a guy who had no television experience and was just a guy in New York doing sets at the clubs. I took over for him, and overnight I was on TV 7 days a week, and because E then was not the E you see now. It was a very new network. They didn't have any money. And, we were constantly making fun of like, we're just basic cable. It doesn't matter. We're doing the show for 75 cents. And so necessity became the mother of invention. Like we had no money. And it had like a morning zoo vibe. My crew was all a part of the show. They were in the sketches.
Yeah, it felt very guerrilla.
Yeah. It really was like, let's put on a show in the barn. My mom made costumes, lunatics running the asylum, and
it seemed like you had a lot of freedom there, though. Could you?
The thing that is so unique about that experience that, quite frankly, I maintain will never really happen again. So, to give you an example, I did over 1,100 shows there in 4.5 years. In 1,140 shows, I never had a note session. Not one. Not one, dude. 900 hours of TV. Nobody ever sat me down and talked about
There was no one there that felt qualified to question you.
They literally did not have the manpower or the infrastructure to watch over our shoulder. When I started there, the only person we showed scripts to was my executive producer. And if she okayed it, we did it. About 3 years in, I became executive producer, and then I was the arbiter of what was okay to do, which is a terrible, terrible idea. Like, we did things that were so dark that I just can't believe we got away with. And
was there any filter? I mean, was there literally no filter between John Henson and the airwaves of E?
I mean, like, you handed the tape, but dude, they were just happy that you gave them a tape and went, "This is a half an hour. You can show."
Do you know what the specific steps are? Like when you hand them that tape, where does that tape go? Does that go somewhere where a bunch of guys review it and they're like, "Oh, I don't know. He said cunt."
No, like it was an honor system. Like you just knew.
Could you have sent them pornography? Is what I'm getting at. Would they have? I mean, you've lost your job, of course.
It would work once.
Would they have just broadcast pornography?
Yeah, exactly. I think you're right, Woody. Once, you could have put it this way. I had a bit that I used to do where I talked about my Uncle Francis, my Uncle Carl. I used to talk about my Uncle Carl being alone in the basement with Uncle Carl. 42-year-old Uncle Carl, and it was like this very dark, and it would always start where I would begin telling a story that would sound like it was really happy, and then it would so like, this is an example. We came out of a Dr. Scholl's dirty sneaker competition clip, on one of the shows, and I was like, "Oh, that something like that happened to me once," and all the crew guys are going, "Oh yeah," and I go, "Yeah, only it wasn't a dirty sneaker competition. It was a dirty underwear competition, and it wasn't sponsored by Dr. Scholl's. It was sponsored by my Uncle Carl, and I was the only one who participated, but I won." And then you hear my crew guy off camera go, "What'd you win?" And I go, 6 stitches. And dude, it was like everybody goes, "Oh," and then like that was the kind of thing that we were doing that was airing 4 times a day and repeated.
That was the 90s.
Like there was nobody going like, "Yeah, no." Like we just did stuff, and
how is that?
And so
the personal side of it, like you were getting recognized in every grocery store that you're shopping in, and
instantaneously, because it was a cult classic, I think, show. You know what I mean? And I don't say that like as in taking ownership of it. It was cult classic, it was cult status with Greg Kinnear. It went on. The other hosts experienced it as well. I happened to be there at a great time in the evolution of the show, and they were taking full-page ads in Rolling Stone. Like I went from being an unknown club comic to every episode, every issue of Rolling Stone for 18 months had a full-page ad of me. It was crazy.
And so when that happens, like there's got to be like other club comics that you were at the same level as, whatever that means. Maybe you get booked the same amount, maybe you get the same pay here or there. These guys are on the same level as you, and suddenly overnight you've blown up like this. What is the reaction that you get from these guys that are your compatriots to some regard?
It's first of all, it's interesting because this was right around the time that I fell out of stand-up, and what happened, the reason it happened was I'd done stand-up for like 7 years, and when they were looking to replace Greg Kinnear, he told me that they looked at over 3,000 people in 5 different cities over 18 months. It was a massive search. Every comic I know auditioned for it. People that weren't comics auditioned for it. Like everybody got seen. That's why when I say like legitimately I was Charlie with the golden ticket, it really was like winning the lottery. It wasn't like I know 25 comics that could have done that job. For whatever reason, they picked me. It could have been
well.
But when I moved from New York to LA to do the job. I took over in January. I think my first show was January 2nd or January 3rd, 1995. And so I moved across the country. I don't know any of the bookers out here. I don't know any of the comics out here. It's an entirely different arena, and there's a big difference between, maybe less now, but back then it was sharks and jets. Like it was, LA comics did not go over necessarily in New York, and New York comics did not go over necessarily in LA. LA was a lot more commercial. New York was a lot more gritty and dirty and angry. A lot of New York comics would talk about coming out to LA and getting like groans or oohs, you know what I mean? Things that would make New York audiences laugh, where it's too harsh for LA. But the big thing was they started live coverage of the OJ trial like 3 weeks after I got there. So they only had one studio, they had 2 studios, but I had to be out of the studio by 8 in the morning, which means I had to be at work at like 4. And, you know, I was a dude that for the last 8 years, I was going to bed at 4. And so all of a sudden, I had to go to sleep at like 7, 8 o'clock at night. You know what I mean? To be able.
So you're not a stand-up anymore. Like that's that.
Like and that went on for 11 months. So like I blinked, and I was, you know, a year out of stand-up, and then, you know, it's a daily television show, so I couldn't travel. I couldn't even, I worked Friday. So it's not even like I could say, well, I'll just do weekends. Like I couldn't fly out, you know, nobody was going to book me just to do a Saturday. So I kind of missed the boat. And I just like, you know, I became so obsessed with television, making TV. Talk Soup was such an exciting period for me creatively that, you know, I don't know. I think I kind of was burned out on stand-up. Like stand-up to me was, you know, the Etch-a-Sketch that I had since I was 8. And, you know, TV felt like a brand new PlayStation 4. Like there was just all this new whole world creatively that I was much more consumed with. And, you know, in retrospect, I did myself a real disservice, and I wish I had stayed with stand-up. But I got lucky and I worked a lot in television. So I stopped doing stand-up for like 16, 17 years. I was out of stand-up for like twice as long as I was a comic.